Welcome to Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast. Your chance to learn about the teachings of the Catholic Church on sacred music, both in theory and practice. Through interviews, discussions, and music, your hearts and minds will be lifted up and better understand what it means to sing the praise of His glory. And now, your hosts, Peter Carter and Dr. Jennifer Donaldson.
Hello, listeners, and welcome to Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast. Today I'm coming to you with ideas about what to do during these times, when faced with concern for the people you serve, especially the most vulnerable, concern for the members of your choir, and the responsibilities to care for people in terms of both their physical and spiritual health. This episode isn't going to dive into the science of droplet production in aerosols, nor suggest ideas on what to do when and where. But we would like to offer listeners a look at some resources that are available to us when looking at musical restrictions, both through a survey of the riches of our sacred music treasury, as well as through the means of modern technology. I've curated a list of things I thought you might find helpful to think about, along with some suggestions from a few colleagues, Nathan Knutson, Charlie Weaver, and James Wetzel. If you're aware of some of the resources mentioned, I hope we'll be able to draw your attention to some that you might not have known about, especially in supplementing work you're already doing with Hymnody. We'll also post a text version of this list, complete with hyperlinks, on our website at sacredmusicpodcast.com. Click on Resources. Let's start with the basics, the Missal chants. As many of our listeners know, one of the main highlights of the recent English translation of the Roman Missal, and now also of the new Missal Romano, is that the music for the priest parts, for the dialogues and acclamations, and also for the Mass Ordinary, the Kyrie, Gloria, etc., is embedded into the main text of the Missal, rather than in an appendix in the back. A lot of people have created resources for these chants, and they're a great way to encourage the singing of something simple, dignified, reverent, and easily committed to memory. We'd like to highlight just a few resources in this regard that you might look at. For practice tracks in English, look up Roman Missal chants on YouTube and the Church Music Association of America's practice tracks list appears. There's also a practice tracks list for Spanish. The Domenico Zippoli Institute has recordings of the Missal Romano chants in both the keys notated in the Missal, as well as in a lower key if the priest feels more comfortable in a lower register. Go to Domenico Zippoli, that's spelled DOMENICOZIPOLI.org. There's also organ accompaniments for the ordinary chants sung by the congregation on the USCCB's website dedicated to the music of the Missal Romano. Harmonizations for the Missal chants for a small choir to sing enrich the beauty of these simple chants. My co-host Peter Carter has composed one for use, and he's posted some recordings of it on their parish Facebook page, St. John the Baptist in Allentown, New Jersey. We've also uploaded these choral scores onto our website. Next on our list, music for Mass Ordinaries that are beautiful, but with limited resources. Let's start first with some Mass settings that would be beautiful to introduce to a congregation and can be sung with just cantor and organ, with or without the people singing. There are a number of really lovely settings on CC Watershed at ccwatershed.org/mass. We'd particularly point you towards the Mass in Honor of Mary, Star of the Sea, a setting in English by Michael Olbash, which has a really lovely and excellent organ accompaniment. It's something we use regularly at St. Joseph's Seminary, and it's based, of course, on the Ave Maris Stella chant. There's also a setting in Latin by Kevin Allen for unison voice and organ entitled Missa Stelliferi Conditor Orbis. Per usual with Kevin's music, it fits the voice well and is melodically rich. Healy Willen wrote a number of really fantastic settings of the Mass for organ and unison voice. Among them are the Masses of Sancta Maria Magdalena, especially the one from 1928. Father Scott Haynes of the Healy Willen Society has adapted the setting to the ISIL English texts. Two other unison masses in Latin are his Mass of St. Teresa in G major from 1930 and the 1927 Mass of St. Peter in F major. Settings are available for purchase at healywillen.com, and that's spelled HEALEYWILLAN. Along the same vein as the Willen is the Missa Puerorum in F, Opus 62, for unison voice and organ by Joseph Reinberger, as well as the Missa in Simplicitate by Jean Langlais, or the Mes Cum Jubilo by Maurice Duraflé. There's also the Choral Mess in C by Anton Bruckner for alto and organ. That one does have the accompaniment of two horns, but it's a lovely setting. The Mass was written for the particular musical restrictions of the rural Austrian village of Windhoek. And even simpler than all of these by Reinberger, Langlais, Duraflé, and Bruckner is the Short Mass in C by R.R. Terry, available on CPDL. And that is cpdl.org, which stands for Choral Public Domain Library. It's charming and extremely modest in musical means, both for the voice and for organ. And of course, there are the Gregorian ordinaries, sticking with something well-known like Mass 8 or Mass 18. But maybe you could introduce a new setting. If you're looking to expand, a good next step during these summer months is certainly Mass 11, the Orbis Factor. We'd also recommend looking perhaps at Masses 4, 9, and 10. If your limitations and resources permit a small scola, here are a few Mass settings you might want to look at that either work really well with one-to-a-part singing or that are sustained by the organ to aid reduced forces. Earlier this season, of course, we drew listeners' attentions to the bird masses for 3, 4, or 5 voices. Of course, you'd need professional singers or really excellent amateurs to pull these off well. There are also a couple of masses by Samuel Webb, and Webb is spelled W-E-B-B-E, who was the choirmaster at the Sardinian Embassy Chapel in London until 1795, and also at the Portuguese Embassy, both places with a fascinating history of the celebration of the Catholic Mass in a land where it had become illegal. The modesty of the situation produced music perfect for our situation as well. Webb's music is available on CPDL and IMSLP. And here, for those of you who aren't aware of it, IMSLP stands for International Music Score Library Project, imslp.org. On CPDL, there's a lovely homophonic setting for treble, tenor, and bass with organ in D minor. You've got to have a good tenor to pull it off, and certain parts of it are out of reach for average singers, but others are not at all. They're lovely. There's also Webb's a cappella setting for 2 voices. It's written for treble and bass in his Mass in A major. You'll find the old typeset copy of it on IMSLP on Webb's entry under Webb's Collection of Modern Sacred Music. Also for 2 voices and organ, there's a lovely setting Messa Facilissima by Guglielmo Mattioli. And a couple more masses we would recommend to you from the historical treasury are the Mess Basse by Gabriel Fauré for women's voices and organ, the Via Donna Missa Sine Nomine for men's voices and organ, the Perosi Missa a 3 voci d'uomo, again for men's voices and organ. There's also a really lovely Mass in F major, Opus 190 for TTBB, that is tenor, tenor, bass, bass, and organ by Joseph Reinberger. Among contemporary Mass settings, we'd recommend to you the Missa Rex Genitor by Kevin Allen and Nicholas Lemmy's Mass for 3 voices, that's set for TTB. If you're looking for something on the simpler side, there's Richard Clark's harmonized chant type Mass setting, Mass in honor of Pope St. John Paul II, again available on ccwatershed.org/mass. The introduction of the Mass proper to a congregation is a topic we hope to do an episode about in the near future. But now is a great time to think about doing so, especially if you're faced with limitations on congregational singing. What to sing? Sing the Mass. Sing the propers of the Mass, the introit, the gradual, the Alleluia, the offertory, and the communion. The standard, of course, are the Gregorian propers themselves. But maybe that's a long-term goal for your parish. What does one do in the meantime, and especially during this time? Perhaps there's been no better time to focus on singing the propers, both for the practical element of allowing a small number of people to sing for all, but also for the riches of Scripture and enriched knowledge of the musical structure of the Roman Rite that singing them offers to parishioners. Many of our listeners are probably aware of myriad resources that have become available in the last 12 years. The first compositional boom in Mass proper is really since the mid-1960s. We'd like to recommend to you the CMAA's page, which compiles resources. That's musicasacra.com/music. It's got some resources for ordinaries, too. A new collection of English language propers that was just published in March 2020 by Richard Rice might also be of interest to listeners. The title page of Hostia Laudis says the collection contains, quote, chant settings of the texts of the Roman Missal and Lectionary with supplemental psalm verses for Sundays and solemnities, end quote. These settings are lovely and, per usual with Richard's work, typeset beautifully. Of course, also from Richard Rice is his Simple Choral Gradual, a collection of harmonized chant settings of the entrance, offertory, and communions. The antiphons for the introit and communion are drawn from Eisel's translation of the Roman Missal, and they're accompanied by verses assigned in the Ordo Cantus Missae. The offertory texts come from the Graduale Romanum and even include the verses of the Offertoriale Triplex. The organ could be used, as Richard suggests in his introduction, to accompany or introduce the singing, or even to supply missing parts. Listeners will also find extremely helpful Jeff Ostrovsky's work on CC Watershed for practice videos, audio-only practice tracks, organ accompaniments, translations, settings of responsorial psalms, and gospel acclamations. This is a treasure trove of free, printable, and emailable resources. For English, go to ccwatershed.org/completed, and for Latin, in the EF, go to ccwatershed.org/goupil, and that's spelled Goupil. We also highly recommend the Liturgical Planning Guide offered by Cantica Nova Publishers. They have huge lists of resources for singing the Mass propers, pointed collects in the solemn tone according to the English Roman Missal, as well as helpful suggestions about Mass ordinaries, organ music, choral music, and hymns listed according to a number of different hymnals you might have in your pews, or not, as the case may be right now. They've also recently started adding resources for the extraordinary form. They're the sort of idea list that can help you find new collections or look up specific compositions on CPDL or IMSLP when it comes to choral and organ repertoire. Along the same line of resources offering music for the propers of the Mass, we'd encourage you to look up Adam Bartlett's new endeavor, sourceandsummit.com. He's launching a full-scale resource for parish use, and including some helpful resources designed to target needs, especially during this time. But this promises a long-term resource for many parishes beyond just the resources he's offering right now. And if you're looking for some Spanish language resources, we'd point you to a couple of spots. You want to check out the hymnal of the Institute of the Incarnate Word, excerpts of which Nathan and Lisa Knudsen have included on the website of the Zipoli Institute. Many accompaniments are also available if you get in touch with them directly. There's also Janet Gorbitz's Spanish Propers Project, which has 2 different versions or more of the entrance and communion antiphons, from an adaptation of the full Gregorian melody down to something closer to the style of the simple English propers, and sometimes even a psalm tone version. I've posted a link to her website as well as some other sites in Spanish with suggested choral repertoire designed for limited resources, or including organ, or settings of the responsorial psalm. Especially when faced with restrictions on singing, it might be a good time to let the organ sing. It might be that the old model of an organ mass is new again. Certainly we're not able to play almost the entire mass while the priest recites the mass quietly, but there's absolutely nothing to prohibit an organist from playing at the entrance, offertory, communion, and retiring procession. Now's a great time to hone your improvisatory skills and look for new repertoire. Are you looking to get better at improvising? Of course, there's the classic 2-volume manual by Marcel Dupré, and there's also Improvising: How to Master the Art by the great improviser Jerry Hancock. I've had a lot of good experience with the book Breaking Free: Organ Improvisation Through 20th Century French Improvisation Techniques. It's by Jeffrey Brilhart, who teaches improvisation at Yale. And he's also got another book called A World of Possibilities. He's got step-by-step guides for development and helpful examples of what improvising in different styles and structures might look like. In terms of new repertoire, take a dive into IMSLP and look for some new collections, new composers, etc. You might even do a search for manuals-only repertoire. But in that regard, we'd highly recommend the excellent resources put out by Noel Jones at his Sacred Music Library. On his basic music shelf, he's got neatly typeset and thoughtful anthologies of music according to season, topic, for manuals only or mostly manuals. The collections and resources he offers are outstanding. While you're there, you should also check out his Catholic choir book anthologies, which are collections of choral music that are eminently practical for parishes, even during this time. He also offers some resources in Spanish, including some hymn accompaniments and an organ playing manual, as well as some resources for unjustly forgotten hymns and hymn playing at the organ. And finally, we'd like to point you to an electronic resource that might be useful during this time. Certainly, there are good reasons to be concerned about the introduction of electronic devices into the Mass. They can be distracting, and there's also just the issue that, unlike all the other things in the Church, they're not set apart for sacred use in the same way that a hymnal is. There's a goodness to having things set apart for sacred use, in the same way that sacred music is set apart for the glory of God and sanctification and edification of the faithful. If, however, you find that you're facing a situation in which some sort of personal electronic device is the best and most prudent aid to your congregation in their participation in the Mass during these times, we'd recommend you check out cloudhymnal.org. You can use it to curate your own worship aid. It integrates with GABC or Gregorio and CPDL, as it has most of Gregobase and lots of editions and text translations from CPDL already uploaded into its musical library. And you can add your own music or search for music hosted on the website. It also integrates with one license. You can make different versions of the music list for your musicians versus the congregation, and you can export the list as a PDF. When you create a community page, it automatically generates a dedicated URL that can be integrated into your parish webpage or Facebook page. Parishioners access the worship aid on their own devices by clicking on the link on your parish homepage to Cloud Hymnal or by plugging in a join code. There's a value here, too, for parishioners who are watching live streams of Masses at home and who need access to a worship aid. Check it out at cloudhymnal.org. We hope you've heard some things here that are new and helpful to you. We'll post a list of all these resources, where to find them, and even more repertoire suggestions on our website, sacredmusicpodcast.com/resources. On that same link, you'll also find a large choral library, courtesy of James Wetzel, with pieces for less numerous forces. It contains a lot for which you'd probably need a professional schola, but we'll highlight some works you might try with skilled amateurs. Finally, we'll create a thread on our Facebook page for you to share resources you're finding helpful at this time. We'd love to hear what you're up to and to have you share your knowledge with other listeners. Until our next episode, may we sing the praise of His glory.
We hope you've enjoyed listening to Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast with Peter Carter and Dr. Jennifer Donaldson. For more information about this episode, sacred music resources, or upcoming events, visit our website at sacredmusicpodcast.com. You can subscribe to our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, YouTube, SoundCloud, or your favorite podcast app. If you enjoy our podcast, please write us a review on iTunes. This improves our iTunes ranking and helps others find out about the podcast. The music you heard at the beginning of this episode is Hec Dies by William Byrd, sung by the London Oratory's Schola Cantorum Boys Choir, directed by Charles Cole, from the CD Sacred Treasures of England. The music at the conclusion of this podcast is the first movement of Trio Sonata No. 6 in G major by Johann Sebastian Bach, performed by Peter Carter. We look forward to having you join us next time, and until then, may we sing the praise of His glory.